America's threat of military action against Syria over the suspected poison gas attack could escalate troubles not only there but also more widely. The warning amid fears of a direct conflict between Washington and Moscow. For one Brussels commentator, it's not a case of if, but when there'll be a military strike.
It has to happen because, again, it's pretty clear that when it did not happen, and I started with that, in 2013, this has basically led to a series of unfolding events where the Assad regime has kept on using chemical weapons against the population. So I think it's pretty clear for Washington and Paris that now we have to somehow draw that thick red line.
It's unclear what kind of military action and its scale would be used against Syria if Trump does decide to go down that route. Experts say what targets are hit and what damage is caused will determine the repercussions.
If the Americans hit the Syrian army and only the Syrian army, then I think the Syrian regime may take revenge by hitting civilians in rebel-held areas in Syria. And that would be terrible for the civilians, but that would still be a contained conflict. However, if the Russians get really upset about what is hit, and if maybe also Russian troops are hit or airplanes, and the same for the Iranians, then you could see an escalation, not just in Syria, but also elsewhere in the region.
Here in Brussels, the European Commission issued a statement of condemnation after what's said to have happened in Duma. It's not so far commented on the subsequent military threat, but a source here has told me that they're closely monitoring the situation with Syria, and it's due to come up for discussion at a Foreign Affairs Council meeting on Monday.
The President's been clear we're working with our partners and allies and our national security team to look at all options. And as we've said, all options are on the table, but I'm not going to get ahead of anything the President may or may not do.
Many people are feared dead in an Algerian military plane crash. There was no immediate confirmation from authorities, but footage of the site clearly shows the burning wreckage of a plane. Local media and witnesses say more than 100 military personnel were on board the aircraft. The plane came down on Wednesday morning near to Boufarik Airport on the northern coast and not far from the capital Algiers. As well as military personnel, it's thought some of their family members were also on the aircraft. Algerian television showed fire engines and ambulances at the scene, as well as officials and witnesses. Some local sources were reported to have said the death toll could be as high as 200.
When the iconic Atomium opened in Brussels 60 years ago, it was making a bold statement. The 9 spheres depicting magnified iron crystals, a show of faith in science, including the development of nuclear power.
6 decades on, the EU depends on nuclear power for more than a quarter of its electricity needs.
Right now, across the bloc, there are 127 operational reactors. France has the most, while here in Belgium, there are 7.
With the war now entering its 8th year, can we say that the international community has failed the Syrian people?
I think we have to conclude that the international community has failed the Syrian people and Syrian children. And I do have a big worry that all this escalation of the conflict, the fact that UN are now confirming that chemicals again have been used as weapon in Syria, the horrors that we are seeing, that almost 2 million people in besieged areas and hard to reach areas are denied food and also medical assistance. This is a new level of horror, and I really fear that we are accepting this as the new normal. Basically, it's a war on children. If you start bombing civilian areas, if you start bombing schools and hospitals, it is a war on children, and we should not accept that.
2017 has indeed been the deadliest year for Syrian children. In 2018 alone, 1,000 children have been killed or injured. Do you think this heavy toll is due to the nature of this conflict, and namely aerial bombings?
when warfare moves into areas where a lot of civilians live, which is basically towns, and don't forget, Eastern Ghouta is basically a suburb of Damascus. Many people live there. And when war moves into these areas, it is an attack on civilians and particularly children.
How about the number of child soldiers? Apparently the number has tripled since 2015.
What happens to children in war is basically that they have an increased risk of being targeted as child soldiers, increased risk of child labor, increased risk of sexual abuse, and of course we are seeing many more girls being married just as very young children married off, because that feels like the safest place for them to be for their families, and also because they become an economic burden of their families.
Let's now talk about the long-term impact of this conflict, namely psychological trauma.
What we are seeing is that these children, they are suffering from post-traumatic stress. Many of us will not know what that is, but that is children who are hiding or going into a stress when they hear the bombings, children who are wetting their beds, children who can't sleep, and basically children who cannot function in a normal way. And I'm asking the international community, how can we ask these children to build up their country if they have no education? We have more than 1.7 million children in Syria who are out of schools because their schools are being bombed. They have no education, they are malnourished, they are extremely scared, they are suffering from toxic stress. How can these children ever build up Syria again?
Russia vows to shoot down any and all missiles fired at Syria. Get ready, Russia, because they will be coming. Nice and new and smart. You shouldn't be partners with a gas-killing animal who kills his people and enjoys it. Now that drew this response from the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry. She said smart missiles must fly toward terrorists, not a legitimate government that has been fighting international terrorism in its territory for several years. Now, clearly, Sandra, you recall you were on the air then last April when the U.S. fired dozens of Tomahawk missiles into Syria, a direct response to the Assad government's slaughter of the Syrian people. Just yesterday in New York, the UN, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, implored the world body to act and to speak with one voice to stop Assad and the Russians. Now, for the White House perspective, officials here acknowledge that while the drumbeat of war may grow louder, the call to rein in the Assad regime is an important one.